I guess so.
All right, so hello everybody and welcome to the first of our two-part series on, well, it's not exactly just on SOPA and PIPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect IP Act, which I'm not even going to try and say the whole name of. But if you've read anything about it or them, you know that those are two bills that are currently pending before Congress, one before the Senate, one before the House. There is a somewhat longish and complicated history to these bills. There was a precursor called COITA that you might have read about that went fairly far but did not end up getting passed. Essentially, suffice it to say that the U.S. legislature has been focused on IP enforcement on the internet for quite a while, and these two bills are, at least at this point, the culmination of some of those efforts. Since you're here today, you also know that there are a number of competing interests, and there are a number of complicated policy issues surrounding the extent to which private intellectual property rights being enforced on the internet should be done through either technical infrastructure or through third-party intermediaries. So today in part one, we're going to talk a little bit about the technical infrastructure and some of the related policy issues. We have an excellent speaker with us. It's a great opportunity. I'm very happy that he's here. I'm also very happy to welcome, I want to say welcome back, but technically he hasn't quite graduated. Some of you might know Rich Peterson, who is working with Andrew at Dine down in Manchester, and Rich has kindly agreed to introduce Andrew. Rich.
Well, I guess Mary informed you about most of the substantive stuff, so I'll keep this very short. My name is Richard Peterson. I work here with Andrew. I work in the legal department at Dynamic Network Services. We are an internet as an infrastructure company doing DNS and email delivery. Andrew here is our director of labs. He also works with ICANN, and he works with the Internet Engineering Task Force. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today, and I want to preface this by saying that I am not a lawyer. I'm a geek for a living, and what I know about really are the bits on the wire and pieces like that. You heard about the Internet Engineering Task Force. What we do, we are a group, loosely organized group of people who make the standards for the internet. So we're like plumbing designers for the internet. We make the pieces, how they fit together, and then plumbers go out and actually build the networks, but we just talk about how the parts fit together. So that's the perspective that I bring to this. So I want to talk a little bit about, some of you will know, I guess, that Wikipedia some time ago, as part of their protest, and Google and a whole bunch of other people, had a Go Black Day. Now, normally when we say go dark in the internet industry, what that means actually is that you made a mistake, you took your site offline, by accident. It's a goof. But in this case, they decided to make the decision to turn services off. And the reason they were doing that is because they believe they are threatened by SOPA and PIPA. And other strategies like that. I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the legislation or the proposed legislation today. First of all, because it's sort of in flux, and anyway, you're all probably better at reading law things than I am. Instead, what I want to talk about is this general strategy, because this is a strategy that we've seen over and over again. So the basic idea is that you've got infrastructure that is the internet. It's the parts that you're using when you use the internet. And people want to alter the consumer behavior, whatever it is. They want to alter users' behavior on the internet by changing the infrastructure itself. So the idea is that you make a change in the network, and that affects the things that are out at the edges. And the most common example of this that we've seen dozens of times is to do this with the DNS, or the domain name system. Now, the domain name system is a fundamental part of the internet. You basically can't do anything without it. So it's a very natural place to identify, well, since everybody's got to use that anyway, we'll put the control there. And so these are just two of the most recent attempts, but people have been trying to do this for many years. Now, let me just get on the table. This is a really bad idea. I mean, it's a stupendously bad idea. The first reason is that the DNS doesn't actually work that way. It just doesn't work the way the model in the legislation has, technically. The second thing is that we've actually designed security extensions in recent years, and the whole point of those security extensions is actually to detect this kind of behavior, identify it, and put it off to the side. And I'll talk a little bit later about why we do that. A third problem with this is that it treats the web as though it's the internet. So the internet is actually not just websites, and this is a really important part. And we'll talk a little bit about how that relationship is and how that misunderstanding is going to inform these ideas that you can just do this in the DNS. And then the final thing that I want to talk a little bit about is how people will just go around this anyway. So even if you could argue that it was a good idea, it won't work anyway. And that's a sort of technical feature of the internet that is just a fact. If we made it work, we would break the internet instead. And I remember when we started talking about this and we were at dinner, and Mary actually said to me, would it really break the internet? And the answer is yes. This is breaking the internet as we know it if you want to adopt this kind of stuff. But it's there's some details about how. So the first thing, in order to understand this, and I'm sorry that I'm going to geek out on you a little bit here, but the fact is that in any legal domain, when you're making laws about stuff, there are parts of the details of that thing that you need to understand before you can make effective law. And a number of the proposals that people have made, not just for laws, but for various kinds of policies, they're frequently based on deep misunderstandings of the technical details. And so we're going to sketch some technical details. When we're done, you won't be able to go home and run your own DNS server, but you will know enough about this to be able to, I hope, to be able to say something intelligent about the effects of a policy. I should say that I don't know the level of technical sophistication in the room, so if there are things that I'm glossing over or that are just confusing, don't hesitate to stop me. It won't throw me off or anything. Please just interrupt me. Okay, so the DNS, or the domain name system, is a distributed hierarchical database. It's hierarchical, it's a tree structure, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, but basically things lower in the tree depend on stuff higher up. It's distributed, and it's distributed in a couple of different ways. First of all, the management of the domain name system is distributed. Different people have control over different parts of it. And also the operation of it is distributed. That is, there are different machines that are involved in these things, and they're not even always under the same administrative control. Now, an interesting property of the DNS is that it scales extremely well. It is perhaps the most successful distributed database in the history of computing. It is a very, very successful system, even though it's crappy. I mean, those of us who work on it at the protocol level, we're always thinking to ourselves, oh, if only we could go back and replace this. But of course, the problem is you can't, because in order to do that, you have to reformat the internet. And reformatting the internet is hard, harder than reinstalling your Windows box. Another very important thing to understand is that this is involved in almost everything you ever do on the internet. There are some very, very low-level things that probably you have never seen happen that are not involved with the domain name system, but everything else is. And that's because you don't speak IP addresses. So when machines talk to one another, they talk to each other in numbers, right? I got a number over here, I got a different number over there, and those are the addresses of the machines. Old IP version 4 addresses have, you've probably seen these from time to time, like 192.168.2.1. And that's a fairly common IPv4 address, but it would be very inconvenient to have to remember. So just go to HTTP 192.168. Probably you wouldn't remember that. So and it's gotten worse when we have IPv6 things, and they're really long strings, and they've got colons in them, and sometimes they have 2 colons, and you have to know, you'd have to have a theory of operation of the internet in order to use this. So domain names are much easier. These are some example domain names. The standard example is example.com or example.net. You'll see these all the time. There are various kinds. Here is law.unh.edu, which is the domain that is used here. I've got some, a long example there, mail.backup.example.nh.us. You notice that these get longer. And they can have many, many labels in them. Actually, there's a length restriction, 255 in total, but you very rarely see a name that long. Each label also, by the way, is restricted to 63 characters, but again, that's a sort of technical detail that's probably not very interesting. Now, This is a hierarchical system. It's a tree structure like in math. So it's a namespace. Com is inside the root domain. And inside com is example. So that's how you get example.com. The root domain, by the way, is special. It's invisible. There's a technical reason for this that I won't bore you with, but it has to do with the way that the DNS encodes on the wire. So you can never see the root, the root name in a name. So here is a little tree diagram that gives you a picture about this. I recycled this, so I'm sorry UNH isn't on here. But up here at the top, oh look, I have my pointer. Up here at the top we've got the root name, and we've got com and org, some other things. There's ARPA, there's CA. I'm crankycanuck.ca, that's me at home. I'm Canadian, by the way. Sorry about that. And you know, here we are. For instance, here's the example.com domain, and inside example.com, you can see there's mail. So that's sort of the way the tree works. It's just a set of names. Now, inside these names, at any one of these nodes, you've got this name. And of course, there are nodes that don't exist because they don't have anything at them, but they're still, it's a tree structure. So mathematically, of course, all of the possible names exist there. Inside each name are a set of resource records, and resource records identify particular things on the internet. So resource records always have a name, and then the resource record has a name and a type and a class, and then it has the value on the right-hand side. The particular type that we're usually talking about are host records. So they're called A and quad A. Quad A is 4 A's, and that's to identify the name with an IPv4 address and the name with an IPv6 address. The reason I'm bringing up that particular detail about RR types is that the A and quad A types are a subset of all of the types in the DNS. We don't need to get into all the details, but the important thing to understand is that those other types are not just there for decoration. We use them. They have, they have utility. And the reason that it's important to identify exactly what it is you're trying to change in the DNS is precisely because sometimes people say, I want to take down that domain, and what you really mean is I want to take down a particular host that happens to have that name, but there are other useful things at that same name in the DNS. So it isn't so much that you want to take down, for instance, evil.example.com, but what you want to do is take down the host named evil.example.com, and if you wanted to do this in the DNS, you don't really want to get rid of the name. What you want to do is get rid of the resource record that points you at that thing. So that's the difference that I'm trying to get to. Okay, so I mentioned distributed management before. Different parts of the namespace are managed by different people. So you can imagine if we tried to run the internet with this and we had one guy who had to keep track of all of the names, that would be very awkward because he'd put it in his pocket and then he'd lose it and you wouldn't be able to find your name. Yes, please.
Does example.com have a different IP address than mail.example.com?
It can. It need not, but it can. And so to put a slightly greater emphasis on that, the mapping here is very, very loose. And that's the reason we have the domain name system, right? So that you could have the same IP address. In fact, you could have the same IP address at mail.example.com and say crankycanuck.ca. They could point to the same place because they're just names. And this gives you a level of indirection via the DNS that is one of the strengths of the system because it can point to the same place. But by the same token, what that means is to take down the particular host, you can't take down one name. You got to take down all of the names by which that host is known, or you haven't taken that host off the internet. So as I was saying, there's this distributed management function, and the way that this has been broken up is into subchunks called zones. And the coordination happens across the zone cut. So the place where the parent side of that cut and the child side of that cut have to agree, you have to coordinate there. But once that has happened in an operation called delegation, the parent has given away the namespace underneath. And all of the things inside that namespace are under the control of the person on the child side. So if I am the root zone operator here and I delegate away .com to VeriSign, as this happened, So the IANA function holds the root zone, VeriSign happens to run .com, and so everything that goes underneath .com, you don't have to talk to the people at the root zone, you talk to the people running .com. And if you want to get example.com, so you get example.com, you talk to VeriSign, VeriSign says, here you go, here's your example.com, and now you own that. VeriSign needs to know only the pieces that allow them to redirect people to you, and that's all there is to it. Everything inside example.com, you don't have to talk to VeriSign again. And the way you look this up when you're doing a transaction on the internet, what you look up is data from the authoritative zones. These authoritative zones are the servers that hold the information about that name. So I have a little diagram of some zones here, and you can see these zones can be anywhere in the tree, and they can be quite large. So in the blue one there is actually the domain name of the authority for the .ca domain, Sira. And so they have Sira.ca, and they have all of the stuff underneath it. I don't really run anything in my Cranky Canuck zone, so you see it's just kind of there on its own. And you see that I've got this example one that I put underneath corp.dyn.com. I've got this special little zone down here, and the point of having that there is to illustrate that you can have a zone cut anywhere. So in this example, there's a zone cut here between Dyn and Com, and then there's another zone cut here. But Corp and MHT are all part of that same zone. So these are administrative boundaries inside the DNS. In order to in order to do something about the place that controls this zone, you need to talk to the operator of that zone and not anybody else. Those are the people that you need to talk to. If you want to get rid of this zone, you can talk to these people, and you can mostly get rid of it. Not all the time, but you can mostly get rid of it. Okay, so the idea now, right, since we've got these authority servers, you just talk to the authority server, and we're all done, right? Well, no. This is the standard picture that you would get if you thought that, right? You want to look up corp.dyn.com. So what do? You go to the root zone, you say, how do I get to this thing? And it says, I don't know about that. Talk to the people at com. So, they get back to you and they say, talk to the people at com, I don't know. So you talk to the people at com and you say, I want subzone.corp.dyn.com. And the people at com say, well, I delegated that away, so talk to the people at dyn.com. And you talk to the people at dyn.com, and the people at dyn.com say, I delegated that away. Go over here. Those people at subzone.corp.dyn.com, they know all about it. So that's the standard theory about how this works. You see, it's a recursive. You chase the thing all the way down the tree. But that's not actually how it works at all. These are the Family Feud X's, right? I was pretty impressed with myself for that. That's like, They taught me a couple of things in philosophy school. So the actual way that that things work really on the internet involves recursive servers. So this is another part of that distributed operation that I mentioned. Not the distributed management, but now the distributed operation. So if I'm the guy down here on this little computer, this is my home computer, let's pretend, I want to look something up, I ask my ISP's DNS server. But my ISP's DNS server is not an authoritative server. It's a recursive server. The recursive server does the job for me. So I have what's called a stub resolver in my system. The stub resolver is very stupid, and it just says, I need this. And it goes and asks the recursive server, or what is sometimes called a full service resolver. See, we got like 8 names. So this isn't complicated enough. We got 8 names for every part of this. It's really great. So this is called a recursive server, oopsie, and it goes and does the work for me. So I want to find, example.com. I say example.com, and he goes, gets example.com from the authoritative server that's up here, comes back, gets the answer, and then processes it and hands it back to me. And just because it's a nice thing to do, it caches that record. It holds onto it and remembers it for a period of time. And the reason it remembers it for a period of time is because probably somebody else in the house, like example.com, sort of a boring one, right? But CNN.com, probably going to be hit a lot. Google.com, those records are used really, really often. It would be stupid to go and ask again the next millisecond when somebody else comes along and wants to go and do Google. So instead, I remember what that is, and the next guy comes along and says, I want to go to Google also. I can just hand it back, and I don't even need to ask these guys above me. So that's another way in which this is a distributed management. It's cached in these recursive servers. The proposal in SOPA and PIPA is effectively to say, aha, we've got these recursive servers all over the place. Let's put the control there. So the idea is effectively to put the control there. And the reason to do this, of course, is because you can do that intra-territorially. Did I use the word right? The point is that, right, the authoritative server could be outside the United States. Congress can't make laws about that. But they can make laws about activities that are going on in the United States. So what you do is you make a rule about what the ISP has to do. And so you tell the ISP, take this down, and you tell then the recursive server, here's a bad guy, you know, evil.com. Don't go and look up evil. By the way, evil.com is a real domain name, so I shouldn't be using it as an example. So the evil guy, you know, shut him down. The recursive server then doesn't do that lookup. Instead, it lies to the endpoint. It says, no, I'm not going to look that up for you. Okay, this all sounds like a great idea, right? Very, very easy. Those people are all under US law. We can do something with them. The problem is that on the internet, you don't have that control. The number one thing to understand about the internet is that you are so not in control for every value of you. Nobody can control the way that these transactions go on the internet. Down here, I can just say, well, my ISP lies to me, so I'm not going to ask him. I'm going to do the asking myself. I can install that software. I have it here on my laptop. It's free. You can download it today and do it yourself, and you can turn this on. And immediately, all of the plans of people who say, well, we're going to put this in the recursives, it's broken. But there are downsides to that. We're going to talk about that in a moment. So there are just a couple more details of how this all works that I want to get on the table before we go on to the substance of what the practicalities are. The usual thing that you hear is what we're going to do. We're going to put this bad, this lying answer from the recursive server, and we're going to shut the DNS down for this bad site. And what you see is something very like this. So this is a web lookup. Here's the guy, got his laptop. He wants to look something up. So he wants to go to a web page, right? So what happens is he asks his computer, you type in the URL bar, you click a link or whatever, you go to Google. Your computer asks the recursive server, this is in the normal story, asks the recursive server, okay, how do I get to www.example.com? And in this case, as you can see, I've got an A there. So A question mark means I want to look up the A record for this. I'm trying to find the IP address for that name. So the recursive server goes and gets it, and he asks the authoritative server. This is the authoritative server up here. The authoritative server gives back an answer. Now my laptop knows where to find that thing, and then it contacts that host over here, that server, the web server. So all of this has gone on in the background. Then it goes and gets the web server, and it says, please give me the web page, and the web server gives the thing back. But there's a really important thing to notice here. There's a guy standing there. That is, there's somebody on the end of this. So if in this scenario you give an answer back from this recursive server that isn't strictly speaking true, and there's an error, there's somebody here, the little blue guy, who can receive that error and say, oh, I get it, I can't go there, it's broken. But that's not true for other kinds of services. So here is mail. Mail doesn't work this way. When you send an email, it's a completely asynchronous system. So you send an email, what you do is you're down here, blue guy, at the laptop, sends a mail off to this guy. Oops, and I've got a little extra arrow there. Sorry about the extra arrow. So sends the little sends the mail off to the mail server. So this is the mail server here. The mail server goes and asks the recursive server, how do I send mail to this guy? That's what that MX record is, the mail exchanger. So how do I send mail to this guy? The recursive server goes and asks the authority server, how do I get the mail for this guy? Or maybe it has it in cache, and so it just uses it from cache, but pretend that there was no cache this time. It gets the answer back, then it responds to the mail server. So now the mail server's still got this mail sitting there, right? He's just looking this up. Okay, how do I got this mail now? Where do I send it? Now I've got the answer, and so I send the mail off to the mail server for this guy, and then presumably the mail server is correctly configured, it accepts the mail, and then finally when the person who is receiving my mail, they ask for their mail, they get their mail, and they go woohoo, and that's why the arms are up in the air. So that's a successful mail transaction. Now remember, in the previous one, the idea here is that we've got, the law has come in and said, no, you're not going to answer for this bad guy. You're not going to answer DNS requests for that. Not allowed. But in this case, and here, whoopsie, that's no good. Now I've done it. Come on. In this case, I still have somebody standing here, right? Because it's a real-time transaction. So somebody's standing there. If there's an error, then that person can react to the error and make a decision. In this case, there's no person standing there. The person sent the mail and went away. The DNS lookup is happening inside the mail server. And the mail server doesn't have anybody sitting there to react to this. All the mail server can do under those circumstances is generate a bounce message and send the bounce message back to you, and that's many hours later. And anyway, how many of you have ever seen a bounce message? You guys look at your spam folders then. It used to be, like in the bad old days when I come from, you always looked at your bounces. You always looked at all of the bounce messages and you read through them all to try to figure out what was going on. But in the current spam environment, you see, what happens is there's a lot of phony messages that come in that are bounces, and by and large, people do not read their bounce messages anymore. I know people who just drop them on the floor. They don't even look them up. Like they don't receive them. They go immediately into the spam junker, and they're shredded. So you guys are all really responsible internet users, and I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. But know that when somebody else gets a bounce message to you, probably they don't look at it. So the problem here is that the mail server doesn't have anything to do, so the best it can do is generate a bounce message, but apart from that, there's nothing it can do. This pattern is much more common than the web pattern on the internet. Much more common. Most interactions on the internet are from one machine to another and not from a person sitting at a machine. If we interfere with the DNS, what happens is we protect one group of people's interests by creating an externality for the people who are running those servers. Right? The costs have not gone away. Somebody's property is being attacked. Somebody's intellectual property is being attacked. Okay, we turn down that service in the DNS. What we have just done is moved the cost from the intellectual property holder who has presumably endured a loss because of, sorry, I did a lot of economics in the past, who's presumably endured a loss because of the lost opportunity and so on. We move that cost actually onto the operator of this mail server, who now has additional traffic to deal with, has to deal with user support issues because the user wants to know why the email didn't work, has to cope with the additional logging, and has to keep the mail in flight for much longer because that's one of the promises that they made when they started running a mail server. So it isn't like this is a small change and all we're going to do is turn something off for somebody and it just won't work. What it does is it just shifts the costs around. That's usually the case on the internet. So these are all of the background things that I wanted to lay out. So what are the problems? What are the problems with any approach? It's not just the particular examples that we're talking about in SOPA and PIPA. The problems are endemic to any approach where you try to make the infrastructure smarter. And the reason for this is, first of all, the first thing that I mentioned. People will just go around it. This is actually the least of the issues. But it's an important one. The fact is that if you try to make the infrastructure smarter so that people can't do what they want, they will find a different way to do it. And the internet is designed precisely to enable that different way to do it. That's what makes the internet work. Yes?
You've explained how it can't be done, and yet China seems to do it quite easily.
So it's interesting that you say that. I have a fair amount of information about, but not a lot of information, about exactly how well that works inside China. And there are two things to remember about it. The first thing is China is partly able to do this because they have a very different legal regime than we do. And that means that they have complete control over all of the commercial interactions between companies inside the country and companies outside the country at their border. There are no points of connection between China and the rest of the world that are not filtered through a government control point. That is not true of the contemporary internet here. We simply don't have that kind of control because that's private property from our point of view. In China, they don't have that view. The second thing is that, as a matter of fact, the Great Firewall doesn't work that well. It mostly works most of the time, but for particular kinds of cases, people know how to get over it, and they're able to do those kinds of things. Also, having used the internet in China, a lot of it doesn't work very well. So another important feature of the internet in China is that you have to be prepared all the time for stuff just not to work. Surprise. Today it isn't working if you're on a public network. If you're in a hotel that a lot of Westerners are at, you tend not to have problems. But if you're at some web cafe or something like that and you go to a place that you're not supposed to, it will not work. When I was there, for instance, no YouTube was possible the day that I was there because YouTube had some stuff on it that was not allowed, and therefore, like, all of YouTube was shut down. Now, you can argue, okay, YouTube isn't really that important. People don't need to see LOL cats that badly. But if we think that that's a valuable service, then what we're talking about here actually is trading off whether that service works or not. So in fact, the Chinese example is a case of breaking the internet. We could say we were willing to make that trade, and it's true that that as a legal matter and as a culture, we could decide the trade-off is worth doing. We're going to put this kind of control in so that intellectual property can be protected that way. But we have to be honest with ourselves about what we're doing in that case. We are turning off a large number of services. This particular example, however, this ability to go around it, the way that the Chinese solve this problem is that you can't do this either. So if you tried to do this and you tried to access the authority servers, a little more geekish. In order to do this effectively, what you have to do is run a full service resolver on your own machine, which you can do. But in order to do that, you have to have direct access to the root name servers at the very least. And the answer that China has to that is that they won't route you there. So the internet, that part of the internet doesn't work at all in China. You have to have like a state license to talk to the root name servers. And if you don't, then your packets won't go there. They will just not flow. So that's the going around it. But there's another thing that I want to point out about this going around it. In a less constrained environment than the Chinese internet, what we would find is that people who don't understand the technology will accept suggestions from other people in order to enable this, right? And what they will do is they'll download stuff and they'll press on links that they shouldn't do and everything like that. We have nowhere near a handle on the spam and malware problems that we've already got on the internet. And what this is going to do is give people another reason to install random software from some guy they don't know. This will make the internet worse for everybody. We will have more attacks, we will have more botnets, and we will have bigger security problems than we already have. An important thing to recognize is that many of the malware, malware is what we geeks call the bad stuff that you shouldn't install on your machine, the stuff that your antivirus tries to find and stamp out. We call it malware because it's bad stuff, right? Already those malware authors are using this technique. They are already redirecting the DNS queries of people. So they would love to give people a reason to do that on purpose. That would be like their wildest dream. It would be an excellent idea for them. There's a second thing about this that's really important, and I touched on this very briefly, but if you look at this model, you can see that there are a lot of different people involved in any kind of DNS transaction here. And if you are this person out here at the end, you want to be sure that the data that you got is the data that you really should have got. And if you've got a deep tree, like one of these things, and you're looking for that subzone, you've got a large number of different DNS servers that you have to talk to there, right? What do we have? Four different sources of the data. You need to make sure that all four of those sources, the answers that you get for all four of them, really are good. Because if not, you can be redirected to somewhere else. It turns out that in the bad old days of the early internet, when it was an experimental network, we didn't care about that security problem because machines were expensive and bits were, bandwidth was very constrained. And so the DNS is an extremely lightweight protocol that has effectively no security in it. And this allows for various kinds of attacks where you redirect people. So we've invented something called the DNS security extensions. And the DNS security extensions are a cryptographic signature where when you get the answer, you can check it and say, is that the one that's really out there in the DNS? And you can prove this to yourself using magic cryptography that is too complicated to explain. The kind of behavior that replaces answers in the DNS by going to recursive servers and just changing them is indistinguishable from an attack by a bad guy who is giving you a lousy answer. You can't actually tell the difference between those two things. All you know is that the answer that you got back doesn't match the thing, the calculation that you would have to do in order to check that signature. So what we are going to do if we adopt solutions like changing the infrastructure in the DNS, what we're going to do is break our ability to build more secure internet services using the DNS security extensions. This would be this is a foot gun of enormous proportions. We shouldn't do that because the problems that we have on the internet mostly have to do with poor end-to-end communications between people with authentication. Authentication is a hugely important feature on the internet, and we're only just getting good at it. So to undermine the facility that we're building, and we're busy deploying it, to undermine that facility in order to protect a different thing, actually what we're doing is we're trading away a feature that we desperately need in order to solve a different problem, and not that well anyway. Another thing that is very important, and I already touched on this a little bit, is that the web is not the internet. So remember, this is the web case, and so if we adopt things in the DNS, or for that matter, if we adopt it anywhere else in the infrastructure, the basic problems, they all happen, but at the very least you've got somebody at the end, and you can give them a useful message, and they can understand what happened. But for most of the internet, that isn't true. For most of the internet, you don't have anybody there, and you can't give them this message, and there isn't any convenient way to do it. What will happen instead is that stuff will get buried in a protocol message somewhere. So not only are you creating this externality for people, but on top of it, you are putting this message in a place where nobody can find it. So we will break things in a way that the protocols won't work as expected. Finally, and this is maybe the most important thing, the way that the internet is designed it depends on a principle that we in the engineering community call the end-to-end principle. The old phone network, for instance, was a very, very intelligent network. There was a lot of smarts inside the switching mechanisms on the phone. And when you picked up the phone and you called somewhere else, what you actually got was a circuit from your phone handset to the guy at the other end on the phone. It was literally, there were wires all the way along. And all of the intelligence in that system lay in figuring out how automatically to switch all of that stuff so that you could get the circuit. And many of you are probably too young to remember this, but it used to be that you would pick up the phone on really busy days and you get just this kind of weird tone that told you that you couldn't get a line. And what that meant was literally you couldn't get a line. There was no physical wire that would go between you and the other place. You just get that answer. None of that is true anymore. That's not how the phone system works anymore. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because of the internet. We do packet switching now. The internet is designed to put the intelligence out at the ends. So if any of you have ever used Facebook, I imagine there's probably a few of you, and you've played a game on there, that is a really good example of one of these things where a feature that just wouldn't have been possible in an intelligent network is possible because you have a smart endpoint. The middle parts of that interaction between you and the Facebook servers are very stupid. They're low-level protocols, and they're really just schlepping bits around. They're giving you these things, and here's the stuff, and now you're way out at the end, and you say, I am smart enough that I know how to do this thing, and I can play Angry Birds inside of my my machine, and everybody's happy. If you tried to put the intelligence of that inside the network, every time you wanted to deploy a new version of Angry Birds, you've got to upgrade the network, not upgrade the endpoint, right? If your friend doesn't have the latest browser or whatever, that doesn't affect your ability to do it. That doesn't affect your ability to use that latest feature because you can install the new browser on your computer and your computer gets the feature right away. But if the network has to be changed in order to enable these things, then what has to happen is that all of the network points have to be upgraded and everybody gets the feature or nobody does, all at the same time. This is, I believe, that we would not have the internet as we have it today if the internet had been designed that way. The kind of innovation that we get from the internet by putting the intelligence at the end means that it is very, very cheap to deploy a new idea. You want to deploy some kind of new game inside of Facebook? It's not hard because you just put the thing up inside Facebook, and then anybody who's going to use that, they can they can run it inside their browser. And if what they've got is an ancient old computer like a Commodore 64, and they don't have internet access and they got a 1200 baud modem, they don't see. There are only a few of you who even know what that is. Then they don't have that ability, but they don't constrain your ability to use that. This end-to-end principle in the engineering of the internet is so critical that if we start fooling with it and start saying, well, we can just make the network a little bit more intelligent here because it gives us this other benefit, what we will gradually do is undermine the strength of the entire network, and we will cease to have the ability to have those kinds of innovations that we all enjoy. And I want to, so the Facebook example is maybe kind of trivial, but I want to draw a different example. The designers of the original ARPANET, which is the ancestor of the internet, thought that file transfer between the academic institutions that were involved in the original thing, they thought that was going to be super important. And they thought it was going to be super important that you could log into a machine on the other side of the world and do some work there and then have the results processed there. One day somebody said, gee, it'd be sort of fun to be able to hand messages to the other guy at the other end. And he invented email that way. Nobody had even thought that email was a thing to do. It had never occurred to them. It was not a thing in the design. Nobody thought about email even one time. Within a year, email was the #1 application on the network. It completely took over. And we wouldn't have the internet today if we didn't have email. Nobody would have wanted it. But email was an absolute killer application. It would have been impossible to do that if you'd tried to do it in the network. You just couldn't have done it. The French did try to do it, right? They had the Minitel system. And that was all, the intelligence was all in the network. And then when it was time to upgrade it, you had to replace everybody's handset in the country. Well, that wasn't an answer. Whereas if you wanted a new email client, you compiled it on your machine and ran it. All you had to do. You didn't have to do anything else. Nobody else on the network needed to know about it. We must not give that up. That is the most important feature of the internet, and if we start to fool with it, we are going to lose the entire internet. That is the way this would break the internet. I thank you very much for listening to me going on, and if you have any additional questions or want to suggest that I'm completely out of my mind, take your hits. Please.
What ways do people suggest now, in the field maybe, to have exercise control over the endpoints?
So this is really the key question. How do we control those endpoints? And in particular, how do we control the endpoints when they're outside of the country? Because that's really where the problem is that this particular set of legislation proposals was aimed to do. I don't know. I have a couple of sketchy ideas about this. We are working inside the Internet Engineering Task Force on a set of protocols called Repute, which is essentially trying to build spam reputation software for everything else on the internet. If we were to do that, then it would be possible to detect, I think, over time, patterns of abuse, where we could identify people who regularly had these kinds of violations inside their network or whatever. Now, we can do some of that today. We're already able to do it. If you ask, if you ask, for instance, copyright attorneys, I'm sure they will be able to tell you where most of the really awful things are. But I think having a protocol by which you could process these things automatically might, in fact, enable people to recognize when they're getting to a site that could be delivering some of this content. One of the things that's important to recognize is that a lot of the content that is a target of much of this legislation doesn't stand on its own, right? So if you're somebody who is a completely law-abiding, friendly to business and contracts and so on kind of person, you're not really going to stand up a big server that is there just to hold other people's content that you've got by some illegal means. What's more likely is that you're going to be hosting this in a service that also contains other kinds of stuff because you've got some sort of position that you're not going to censor it or whatever. That other kind of stuff, much of it is extremely unreliable. There's a lot of malware in these in these distribution sites. You get a lot of infections that come from those kinds of things. Many of them are, in fact, just they're just dangling these offerings in front of people in an effort to attract them so that they can infect the computer. If that's the case, and I believe it to be, then exposing the reputation of these people are serving you garbage to the user is the kind of thing that would give users an incentive not to use the content in violation of the copyright or the trademark, whatever you like. So the basic idea here is that rather than trying to control the endpoint, what we do is we change the incentives so that the user doesn't want the stuff as much. It wouldn't matter, right? It wouldn't matter if like the entire Disney collection was up on a server somewhere if nobody ever went there. I mean, I'm sure Disney's lawyers would be very upset about it, but for practical purposes, it wouldn't be worth changing the way the internet works in order to solve that problem, right? That's really just the kind of thing. It doesn't have any practical value. We recognize that your copyright is being violated here because these guys have this stuff, but nobody's looking at it. Why do you care? If we can if we can provide the facilities on the internet so that people can detect that they are going to the kind of site that is likely to infect them, then I believe they are less likely to go there. But the key to this kind of service is that it needs to be widely deployed, and also it needs to happen in real time when the user is looking at the site, right? The other thing that is important to remember about this thing is that the reason this is the target is because this is the kind of person you want to get a hold of, right? Whenever there are proposals to replace pieces of the infrastructure in order to solve any of these kinds of problems, it's always this kind of user, and therefore this kind of transaction. The mail type transactions where it's server to server, they're just like collateral damage. So these are the cases where we can put a notice up in front of the user, and we could tailor that protocol so that it would only really happen when there was a user on the end anyway, right? Because the user would ask for it. And that's the kind of thing where I think if we give the users an incentive not to do those things, then probably they won't. It won't be perfect. There will always be violators, but I mean, if we think we're going to solve the human condition by like a little tweak to the internet, I don't think we're going to get there. Yes.
So let's say like SOPA does end up passing. Do you think we're going to have, and right now we just have the one internet, do you think we're going to have like a system of like dark nets or alternative internet type structures spring up to kind of shift consumer need away from something that becomes unworkable? Well,
there are two answers to that. The first answer is that we don't really have one internet. The internet, I mean, the inter there is an operative part of the word. The internet is really a network of networks, and you are on a network here, and that network is connected to other networks, and then there are rules about what can go in and can go out. And that's, often, for instance, you have to be on the local network in order to print. If you try to send stuff to the printer from your house, then the house says, sorry, I can't find the printer, unless you're Apple. Apparently, Apple has a printer that anybody can send to from anywhere in the world. I don't know what it's named. So in one sense, we already have this. In another sense, I think probably not, because it might be really inconvenient. But it's the really inconvenient that's part of the question. If this kind of change is inconvenient enough, then it will cause people to start making those sorts of changes. And if they start making the kinds of changes where, for instance, everybody starts doing this, there are real effects to all of us, right? There's an advantage to having that cache, that fat cache at your ISP, because you don't have to wait as long for Google's page to load because somebody else already got the DNS thing for you, right? And if we lose that, everybody will go slower, and then the natural question will be, well, what are we going to start to see? Will we see these kinds of breaking apart? Finally, we talked a little bit about China before, and China is a good example. The network in China is a good example of places where we've already got a little bit of fragmentation. We've got pieces of the network that don't really talk to other parts of the network, and it's sort of unfortunate, because what it means is that you've got parts of the world where certain kinds of services can't be relied upon. And I think it would be a shame if we did that, but I think there is that risk. Yes?
Where do you see the legislation going from here? Do you think that they'll still try and do a SOPA type of thing, or do you think that eventually they'll kind of change their tune and kind of take a look at things like this and the problem?
Well, it is my desperate hope that this idea will go away, but I've been at this for a number of years, and I've seen these ideas come up over and over again. It used to be that companies were doing this all the time, right? This was a favorite thing to do inside of companies, and to a certain extent, companies still do this kind of thing. There have been a large number of proposals to do this in every school. And some school districts continue to run this way. And I mean, in those particular cases, we can say, well, we've made a decision about the features that we're not going to enable, and we're doing that on purpose. We're doing that with our eyes wide open. But, just as any kind of simple analogy between, like, your family and the national government, that always gets people going. So these kinds of, well, on your home network, this is the way it works, and so the internet's just like that, right? And people gravitate to those kinds of analogies. So my feeling is that this kind of proposal, I mean, right now my understanding is that it's pretty much stalled and everybody's sort of embarrassed to talk about it, but I expect it'll be back. It may be back in a different name, but it'd be a similar kind of idea. The problem is that it's just too attractive. It's the idea that the network could be fixed to solve this is really an attractive nuisance, and I don't think that we're ever going to get away from that fact. I'm depressed about it, though. All right, well, I see no more hands, so thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope it's been useful. Mary has my contact information, so if people have follow-up things or anything like that, something that occurs to you later, don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much.